Okay, hello and welcome to this lesson on the Prelude by William Wordsworth. Wordsworth was a romantic poet and the Prelude was autobiographical. Okay? It was about his own life and it recaptures the life he lived as a child, and it's done mostly through the senses. It's a very beautiful poem about nature. Wordsworth, I thought this photo was brilliant, this picture, this painting done of him. He just looks so miserable. And it just made me laugh because his poem's actually quite cheery. So he's best known for the Prelude. He started writing it at 28 and he worked on it throughout his whole life. It was called a spiritual autobiography, an account of his life and his experiences. He didn't give it a title. He had various ideas, but he never actually wrote the title for it. He died in 1850 and his wife gave it the title, The Prelude. So it's quite interesting because, of course, a prelude is an opening to something. You'll get them in books and plays. So the fact that that she called it that almost has a really beautiful, hopeful note, especially because she did it posthumously, which means after he died. The Prelude is actually made of 14 books. Obviously, this poem we're looking at is an excerpt from it, but it was planned out like this. So it started with his childhood, his time at school, his residence at Cambridge, his summer holiday, books he'd read, Cambridge in the Alps, quite a privileged man, it appears, his residence in London. Then the number 8 is a retrospect to love of nature, which leads to the love of man. Then 9, 10, 11 are all about living in France. 12 and 13 are imagination and taste, how they are impaired and how they are restored. And number 14 was a conclusion. So we're only looking at a section of it, obviously, but I think the first thing we can acknowledge is that he was not a man who minced his words. He obviously had plenty to say and wrote it for his entire life, for a good 20 odd years. So this is the section you're studying. And in the frosty season, when the sun was set and visible for many a mile, the cottage windows through the twilight blazed, I heeded not the summons. Happy time it was, indeed, for all of us. To me, it was a time of rapture. Clear and loud, the village clock tolled 6. I wheeled about, proud and exulting, like an untired horse that cares not for his home. All shod with steel, we hissed along the polished ice, in games confederate, imitative of the chase and woodland pleasures. The resounding horn, the pack loud bellowing, and the hunted hare. So through the darkness and the cold we flew, and not a voice was idle with the din. Meanwhile, the precipices rang aloud. The leafless trees and every icy crag tinkled like iron, while the distant hills into the tumult sent an alien sound of melancholy, not unnoticed, while the stars eastward were sparkling clear, and in the west the orange sky of evening died away. So this part of the poem is about a moment in his childhood. He's ice skating with his friends, and it's just about the joy of that moment. It's very nostalgic. He's looking back on the past with a huge amount of hope and positivity. And so it's just about that, being with nature, being a child, being hopeful, being happy. And that's what's really interesting. So I'm going to dig into some annotation now. And it starts with a conjunction. It's in the middle of a conversation, so it's like he's talking to us, talking to the reader. Okay, it's also the frosty season is a very poetic way of talking about winter. Winter in literature is a time of death. Obviously, Game of Thrones has brought in many more jokes, but generally speaking, it's a time when crops won't grow, you're not going to harvest and you're not going to plant. And so it's a dead time in society. Even now, in a time when things are generally available everywhere, it still reflects a certain absence. There's no leaves on the trees, it's getting darker, it's cold. And he's calling it the frosty season, which makes it sound cozy and fun and light-hearted. And the sun's set, but that's not a problem because it was visible for many a mile. So there's still this beauty in winter. He's seeing a joy in this passing of time and passing of the seasons, even if he sort of wishes he was a child now. So firstly, if we look here, he should come home, but he's enjoying himself too much. The cottage windows through the twilight blazed. I heeded not the summons. Happy time it was, indeed, for all of us. So heeded is you heed something, you listen to it, you pay attention. He's not listening to his mum telling him to come in for dinner. He's having too much fun. And the fact that it says was here just reminds us for a second again, It was a time of happiness. It was a time of childhood joy. He doesn't necessarily have it now. So it was, to me, it was a time of rapture. Clear and loud, the village clock tolled 6. I wheeled about, proud and exulting like an untied horse that cares not for his home, all shod with steel. So a time of rapture. Rapture is a state of great happiness. It's like peak happiness. It's also a religious event when all the sinners go to hell and all the righteous will be taken up to heaven. So he's making quite a specific point there. That's how happy he was. It's comparing his happiness to religious salvation. And then he's proud and exulting like an untired horse. There's a lot of animalistic imagery in this poem, which is really quite interesting. It shows his freedom, shows his strength, a horse that's just been let go. There's a wildness to that. Not necessarily a bad thing, but there's power, there's nature, there's freedom as well, and joy, I think, in this. And then they are shod with steel. Shod is what you do to a horse. A horse is shod with steel or with iron, as in horseshoes. And so again, the boys that are playing are all being described in a very animalistic way, but actually it just means they're wearing ice skates. They've got ice skates on their feet. And so there's some really interesting language starting to appear. We hissed along the polished ice in games confederate, imitative of the chase and woodland pleasures, the resounding horn, the pack loud bellowing, and the hunted hare. So in this moment, obviously I've separated this, but this is all one stanza. In this moment, they're skating across the ice, but they're obviously playing at pretending to be a pack of hunters, a pack of animals, hunting an animal, or even men hunting animals for sport, which is what the horn would represent, the horn that you blow before you start a hunt. So you've got quite a lot of sibilance here, polished and hissed. It's really evocative. You can hear the skates on the ice in this silent winter's night. And again, it's all this beautiful, positive imagery. Polished ice. It's not ice that's dangerous. It's not threatening. It's not cold. It's polished. It's valued. It's perfect. You polish things you care about. You polish things that are beautiful. And I think that's what he's doing here. So they're pretending to be a hunt again. Whether it's a little bit violent is down to your own interpretation. But I think he's just trying to get the excitement of a group of young boys playing on the ice. It's hopeful, it's joyful, it's boisterous, definitely, but it's just full of life, full of feeling alive. And then you've got the hunted hare, and the H is quite a quiet sound there, which obviously it would be. It's running, metaphorically speaking, it's running away from foxes, people, horses. But I think it's also just a really interesting contrast there, because the pack, he's now calling this group of boys a pack, as in lions, dogs, threatening animals, are bellowing, they are shouting, they are screaming, and then you've got this very quiet sound. So I don't know if it emphasizes their potential for danger, perhaps, or if it's just more about showing again their excitement, their wildness, and their power. So through the darkness and the cold we flew, and not a voice was idle with the din. So again, you've got animal imagery. Humans and nature are intimately connected throughout this poem. They flew. They didn't walk, they didn't skate, they didn't stumble, they flew like a bird, like a free, powerful, natural, obviously, bird. And not a voice was idle. There was nobody quiet, there was nobody lazy. So they're all one in this excitement and this celebration of joy. And again, I said before, this poem is about the senses. And this is what we can hear and what we can feel. It's saying cold. You can feel that cold, but they're flying through it. So it's not affecting them. This is not a poem about the evils of nature, the evils of winter. They're surviving through darkness and cold. Meanwhile, the precipices rang aloud, the leafless trees, and every icy crag. So a precipice is an overhang. If you imagine a snowy scene off a mountain and there's a bit hanging over, that's a precipice. And the trees are leafless. So nature's matching the boys. Nature is being just as loud, just as boisterous, just as happy as the boys are being. Nature's sort of following their lead to some extent. So it's got that kind of, are the boys in charge or is nature in charge? And the trees are leafless, which just takes us out of all this excitement, all this running around for a second, and reminds us this is a time when things die. The trees are leafless because they're not there. They don't. It's too cold for anything to grow, and so it just takes us for a second. Oh yeah, winter's not great for everyone. It's great fun when you're making snow angels and chucking snowballs at your mates, but what's not so much fun is when the trains stop running or you can't grow any food, depending on, obviously I've just switched between eras there, so be aware of that. And the fact that the ice has gone from being polished, as it was quite early on, now it's an icy crag. Much less positive image, almost sounds a bit dangerous. So nature's starting to sort of rear its head at this point. It's matching them, it's warning them, perhaps. And this continues. So every icy crag tinkled like iron, while the distant hills into the tumult sent an alien sound of melancholy, not unnoticed, while the stars eastward were sparkling clear, and in the west the orange sky of evening died away. This is possibly my favourite simile in the history of literature, tinkled like iron. If you remember one thing for your GCSEs, you have to remember that. You've got tinkling, so a beautiful natural sound, caused by the wind, you know, like with wind chimes, for example. Well, my best image of it is from the film Frozen, when the reindeer gets caught in all the snowdrops and shakes them around off his antlers. That's the best tinkling sound I can connect with this poem. So you've got that beautiful image of light, of fairies, of beauty, and then you've got iron. It's a hard metal used to make tools, needs to be put into fire, into great heat to be used. It's a complete contrast. How something can tinkle like iron, I don't know. But it's about the danger of nature. Iron is a tool, often a weapon as well, and you pull it out of the ground. So you've got danger and darkness and strength matched with this beautiful image of tinkling. And so you've got the danger of nature and the beauty of nature are put side by side here in this absolutely amazing simile. And yes, it is an amazing simile. I will not be ashamed of calling it that. Right. And then the distant hills into the tumult sent an alien sound. So alien literally to mean something we don't know, something we don't understand, something we can't understand. And I think that's reminding us that nature we can't actually know. We can strive to know, but nature is still the one in charge of what we understand of it. Nature's still the one sort of holding us back. Nature's still in control. We can't understand it. We can't relate to it, like a god almost. We know it's there, we experience it, but don't try thinking you've got control over it. And it's of melancholy. It's sad, this poem. Nature's actually a little bit sad. He's sad and he's interpreting that sound as sad. This is the memory of his childhood, of a much happier time before life got in the way. He experienced, Wordsworth, actually elements of the French Revolution, was separated for a long time from his family. And so his adulthood wasn't the happiest it could have been. And I think that's part of the reason it's melancholy now, is because it's coming to an end and he's imagining nature knows this. The stars eastward were sparkling clear. So you've still got this absolutely gorgeous image of beauty, of beautiful nature, of also, again, I think wealth and value. If they're sparkling, you can imagine them like jewels, just like the polished ice. There's something valuable, something precious. And in the west, the orange sky of evening died away. And I think that's obviously, again, an image of death, of the end of his childhood, the end of the day, the passing of time. And if you compare that right at the start, so the sky of evening died away, but here the sun was set and visible for many a mile. So the sun could have gone on forever, the night, the day could have lasted forever, they could have been playing forever. If you remember what it's like being that young and hopeful, and you don't see timetables, you don't see the end of the day, you just live. And he's gone from that to, if we go back here, the evening's dead. That sucks. It's now dark and cold. So it's a beautiful poem that sort of takes us through those emotions, that excitement, that freedom, that joy in just living. But then he comes back to the real world and he says, no, nature's still dangerous. It's alien. It's maybe precious like these stars, but everything ends, including this beautiful sunset that he thought would last forever. So that's a whiz through the basics of the actual poem. Now let's have a quick look at the structure. And I'm going to read it again. And in the frosty season, when the sun was set and visible for many a mile, the cottage windows through the twilight blazed. I heeded not the summons. Happy time it was indeed for all of us. To me it was a time of rapture. Clear and loud, the village clock tolled 6. I wheeled about, proud and exulting like an untired horse that cares not for his home. All shod with steel, we hissed along the polished ice, in games confederate, imitative of the chase and woodland pleasures, the resounding horn, the pack, loud bellowing, and the hunted hare. Oops. So through the darkness and the cold we flew, and not a voice was idle with the din. Meanwhile the precipices rang aloud, the leafless trees, and every icy crag tinkled like iron, while the distant hills into the tumult sent an alien sound of melancholy, not unnoticed, while the stars eastward were sparkling clear. And in the west, the orange sky of evening died away. So just want to take you through a couple of little annotations you can add to the ones you've already made. So we start with a conjunction. Nostalgia, he's looking back on his childhood memories. They're playing this hunting game, the energy and the pack mentality of childhood. We've got most of it. But the children are loud and chattering. Not a voice was idle. The noise echoes around the countryside, but the sounds that come back from nature are more alien. They are more unknowable. We can't really relate to them. So you've got throughout this poem, the noise of the children is juxtaposed, excellent word you need to start using, with the quiet magical sounds of nature, the tinkling, the alien sound of melancholy. And so it could arguably be about humans' impact on nature, that nature sounds like this in this poem because the children are all over it. They're imitating nature and they're trying to be part of nature and they're almost getting in the way. They're disrupting it by pretending to be this hunting party. There's a lot of caesura as well. It slows the pace as this memory comes to an end. Okay, the poet is lingering over the end of the memory. So there's a lot more little breaks that we're supposed to be taking as we read this, because it's not as exciting anymore, because it's getting a bit strange and a bit dark and maybe even a bit scary. It's not free and full. He doesn't feel like he's living forever. And he also doesn't want the memory to end. It's a beautiful image of his idyllic childhood. He's not thinking about the French Revolution for once, and he's getting a bit of joy rather than having to think about whatever moment his adult life is in. So he's literally slowing it down to savor it as well. So just to confirm what we're going to say about the structure, it does begin like a story, and in the frosty season, you can almost feel yourself sort of settling down, ready to hear his story about the frosty season. So it does start in the middle of this conversation. It's got this beautifully happy, nostalgic tone at the start. Not only literally he says it was happy, but it was a time of rapture. He is proud and exulting, and all of that is joy and happiness. It then starts about here becoming wilder and pacier. It gets much more exciting. They're hissing along the polished ice. They're a pack. There's a horse. They're like a resounding horn. So the pace is increasing here. It's becoming alive. He's just experiencing life, and he's right back in that moment as a child. Nature does start to become more threatening, though. It goes from the frosty season with the sunset visible for many of a mile to through the darkness and the cold. They're still not being affected by it, but it's dark and cold now. It's not frosty and quite pretty. And that's obviously a specific choice he's making. It's about his own realization of his own childhood. Maybe nature is being threatening. There's precipices, there's icy crags, and they're not polished anymore. And then you've got this image of tinkled like iron, this inherent threat, even while nature is still quite beautiful. It does end finally with this very melancholy tone. He's lingering over it. He wants more to happen, but he knows it can't. And so even nature is melancholy for its own end, for the end of nature, for the end of the day, for the passing of time, for the winter, which is not a pleasant time. Excuse me. And it also reflects the end of his own childhood. The orange sky of evening died away. When he was a child, the sun was set and it was visible for many a mile. The day would go on, life would go on. And now his childhood can't. It's over. He's at least 28 at this point. And so it died away. It just went. And there's something very haunting about about that change. I mean, a sunset is always a metaphor for an ending in this kind of writing, but it's almost like he hadn't realised it until that point, which I think is really, really interesting. So it's a poem full of language about animals, about horses, hares, a pack of animals. It's a poem about nature through the feelings, the sounds, the tinkles, the crags, the alliteration, all that literally makes sounds, but the descriptions of this sound as well, the bellowing, the village clock tolling. Clocks, again, you know, you hear the bell toll, you hear the sound of the clock, it reminds you that time is passing, but he didn't care, not as a child. The time was passing, he was like, yeah, but I'm going to live forever. And that's how everybody feels as a child. We've talked about the idea of things being precious as well. The stars were sparkling clear, the ice was polished. So it's a memory he's desperately trying to hold on to. I mean, he's written 14 books about it, so he's done quite well. But it's about that preciousness, that they're like jewels. They're like expensive, invaluable things. And that's what this experience is to him. So if you would like, if you need extra annotations, which you will be doing as you watch this video, these are the things you could think about. They're the main themes within the prelude. These are the main ideas, okay? It's all about the thrill and excitement of childhood, and I've talked a lot about that freedom, about not really having any responsibility, about just pleasing yourself. And then examples of the power and beauty of nature, of how nature is powerful and essentially will overtake all of us, but it is beautiful and to be appreciated. I remind you that nostalgia means thinking back on something with a really positive look, kind of a rose-tinted look often, so you'll remember something often from your childhood very, very positively. A volta is a big shift. It's a huge shift in the nature of the tone of a poem or the style of a poem, and it indicates generally a change in feeling. Okay, and then challenge yourselves, pick out the most important couplet and explain why it's the most important. So hopefully through that, you'll be able to follow this poem. It's a really, really rich poem. There's so much amazing language in it. One of some of the most beautiful pieces of phrasing, but essentially Wordsworth, like everybody, wanted to go back to being a kid. He wanted to experience joy, he wanted to experience freedom, and he really just wants to go back and play with his friends. So it could also be considered quite a sad poem, as much as it's also a poem about beauty and about nature. Thanks for listening. Hope that helped.